Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. We're back after a summer without webinars, so this is our first one to kick off the rest of the year. I have Kristina and Jennifer here with me. They're both facilitators for UX Academy, also graduates of UX Academy, so they have a lot of experience to share. My name is Emily. I'm the community manager, also a graduate of UX Academy, also a facilitator along with these lovely ladies. So we're really, really happy to have you here. So some ground rules before we get started. This will be a Q&A scenario. So we do have a few options on the left, on the right side, you know my direction here, on the right side of your screen. So we have the chat panel. Everyone's already saying hello. That's awesome. Drop your LinkedIn, say hello, all that fun stuff. If you have any questions along the way, please pop them in the questions tab, mainly so we can make sure that we get to as many of them as possible. If you pop your question in the chat, I may not see it just because of how many people are saying stuff. So everyone else, please help us guide people to the questions tab if there are questions that float around in the chat. Cool. So this will probably be about what, 40 minutes to an hour, just depending on how many good things we have to share and say. Really excited to hear stories, but we're going to kick it off. So again, I'm Emily. Welcome to everyone here. Design Lab webinar. This is a new series called Day in the Life of a UX Designer. There are so many different scenarios that we come across as designers, right? We work on small teams, small companies, big companies. There's also agencies, in-house, like all of these different terms, all these different scenarios that you could run into as a designer. So we're hoping to cover some of these scenarios in a series of webinars. So we'll hope you join us for the next ones. So I'm gonna turn it over to, we're gonna start with Kristina. Kristina, would you like to introduce yourself? Let us know who you are, what you're currently doing, and what made you interested in UX design.
Yeah, for sure. So hello, everyone. Super excited to meet you all. As Emily mentioned, my name is Kristina. I'm currently working as a senior product designer at a company called Reputation. That one I would consider more mid-size. So we're about like 600 overall within the company, but we do have 6 designers total in our team, which has been really exciting. But prior to that, I was working at a very early startup. So I think when I first joined, it was less than 10 people. For whatever reason, we had 3 designers on the team, so we were actually a large majority, which is super rare. But that was also a very interesting experience. So really excited to be able to talk to you all maybe about both of those at some point today. But yeah, prior to that, I was actually a teacher. So I taught 4th grade over here in the Bay Area. I taught that for 2 years, and then I realized Bay Area is very expensive, and unfortunately, it wasn't something that I realized I could probably keep up in the long run. And so I was trying to figure out, where can I go from here? Summer break is coming around the corner, and I need to decide if I'm going to continue on to the school year. Thankfully, somebody I knew at the time was actually going through Design Lab themselves, and they had been asking me to do their user interview sessions and usability, and I was like, what is this? This seems kind of cool. And so I decided to kind of take a deeper look at it. And I thought it paired perfectly because I had minored in graphic design in college. So I was like, okay, I got that visual piece, but it's also like working with others, which I really enjoyed doing with connecting with my students. And so I decided to give it a go. And here I am 2 years later. I think I started Design Lab actually in 2019. So it's been a couple years now. But yeah, it's been a really great experience so far. So yeah.
Thank you. Jennifer, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hey, I'm Jennifer. I'm currently a product designer at a small company called John Burns Real Estate Consulting. I've been here for about a little over a year, and this is my first full-time product design job. Before that, I was doing some freelance gigs. And then, prior to product design, I was always kind of in the art and design world. I was a fine art major, and then I spent most of my career in doing design for film and TV. And then it just ended up not being very sustainable with work-life balance, as well as just really difficult working environment. So I try to find a path that was similar but different. It's similar in a way that in film we're designing for like physical environments, whereas product design we're kind of doing digital. And so it kind of felt like a good pivot. So yeah, that's why I decided on UX design.
So we already have we have a great starter question in the questions tab right now. And I think this is a hot topic, and maybe we'll talk about this first before we get into the day-to-day specifics at what you did, Kristina, at startup, and what you do right now, Jennifer. Hannah's asking, Kristina, also an ex-teacher too, how did you market your skills as a teacher to the new job? So yeah, that's always a spicy one, and I'm sure all three of us have really great stories, but want to hear yours because I know we've been seeing a lot more new students in UX Academy who do have teaching backgrounds. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, I think the biggest things is um, when you are interviewing, there's both the technical skills of being a designer, right? Like understanding how to create wireframes and how to conduct research. But there's also the really important piece of soft skills, which I feel like is actually harder to teach somebody how to collaborate well with others. And I feel like as a teacher, that just like works so well, right? Because you're used to really differentiating your instructions to all of your different students who all have different learning styles and so on and so forth. And so you're kind of already in that headspace of being able to empathize and trying to really understand who your users or your students are. And so I felt like that translated really well with kind of shifting over from teaching to design. But there's also, right, like you work with parents and other teachers and your admin. And that's also all like understanding how to work with different folks. So not exactly the same as working with an engineer or a PM, right? But you have to be able to understand how to work with various stakeholders within the process. So that's another big one as well. But I would also just say, right, like if you like work very closely, like I know there are some like psychologists or like those who work in different roles within the schools, right? You already understand how to work one-on-one with students and trying to understand their way of thinking. For example, if maybe you're in special ed, and those people are also could translate very well to like, for example, UX researcher roles because they already have that experience of being able to work very closely with folks and just trying to understand their thinking. And so those are also other ways as well. I will plug, so I also work as events coordinator for a community called UX of EdTech. And there are a lot of, we actually just had another event talking about those who are trying to help those trying to transition in. So there are a lot of communities out there as well that talk a lot around this subject that I think would be very helpful. So if you want to reach out to me after this event, feel free to do so. And I'm happy to share some additional context and resources around how to market yourself and how to kind of advocate for yourself and what's applicable in your new job.
I think Kristina may have just bought herself another webinar to do with us at some point. So there we go. Jennifer, what about you? How have you marketed your skills, right? Because we all go through the same issues, right? When we trying to be like, no, but I promise I can do the job. Like, how do you convince people?
Yeah, so I feel like, I guess I always say that design ultimately, no matter whether it's product or, film and TV or graphic design or whatever, I feel like ultimately, at least for me, my strategy and thinking process is kind of the same for each of them. So I feel like kind of just selling the fact that even in film, when I was working in film and TV, like it's still a very similar process in the sense that you're still researching characters, you're figuring out who they are, what their backgrounds are, what their motivations are, and then building their environments around who those characters are. And so a lot of these kind of like analytical and strategic skills were kind of transferable. So yeah, I think I talked a lot about that in my interviews.
So it really does seem like soft skills seems to be like the connecting thread between so many of these careers, not even just the ones that you both are from. I'm from retail and support, so I'm 1000% always going to talk about soft skills and how like that's probably way more important than anything that's technical or tool related, right? Like in my mind, I feel like anyone can learn any tool, but how you interact with people largely does based on your personality and just what you're comfortable in doing. So awesome. All right. Well, I mean, that kind of moves us on to a question that was actually submitted by our community really nicely, talking about collaboration. So who do you normally work with or collaborate on a day-to-day? Collaborate with on a day-to-day. There you go. Either one.
I am the sole product designer at my company, so it is a very small and somewhat lonely team. I work with a PM and two developers and me. We're a tiny, tiny team.
Yeah, so for me, as I mentioned, when I first joined the startup, it was really small. So there was our CEO, who I actually got to work with very closely just because there was not that many folks on our team. And he actually kind of took on the role of like PM as well, because at the time we didn't have any product or project managers within the company. I had my head of product design and then also another intern, product design intern, who joined at the same time that I did. So it was, I worked very closely with both of the designers and then the CEO just to understand, for example, like what are the projects that we're trying to tackle? What are the best ways to approach them? I would do design reviews with my fellow teammates. And then we also did work with some overseas engineers. So we had a couple of, I think maybe like one back-end engineer and two front-end engineers. And so those were all done like virtually because they were all overseas. And that was mostly like us handing off design work with them. But also it gave them the opportunity to kind of show us their builds and we could help QA for any like visual issues, for example. We also did work with some like advisors that the company had just as like subject matter experts in particular domains. So we had one, for example, for finance and one for healthcare because our product did kind of touch on multiple pillars. But in terms of like most of my day-to-day collaboration, it was primarily like the CEO, my head of product design, the other designer, and then my engineers.
Follow-up question for you, Kristina. Now that you're working at a larger company, what are the biggest differences in how you interact with people and who you interact with?
Yeah, so I have a lot of PMs now, which was very interesting because I went from essentially 0 to I think there's like at least, I think when I first joined, there was about 10 PMs and it's almost like since doubled. I don't work with all of them, but it is like there's a PM for every single solution within our platform that I support. So I would say I'm regularly working with around 4 PMs at the moment. So that's really interesting. And it's nice because they all have like very specific domain knowledge in their particular areas. Whereas like in the past, our CEO like was obviously he knew a lot, but it was a very different experience like working in grooming tickets and requirements with him than with our PMs. There's also a lot more engineers, right? So I mentioned the one back end and the two front end. So there's way more engineers that I'm supporting now as well. So it's a lot more meetings, I would say, these days, just because of all the folks that I have to work with, of all the different teams that I'm supporting. So just in terms of like my day-to-day has changed just because of the amount of people I have to collaborate with. And obviously with the bigger company, I no longer work with the CEO just because there's a lot more tiers and he's way up higher in the chain, whereas it's a lot more flat in a much smaller company. So that's also like another big difference as well, I'd say.
Got it. Jennifer, you and I are actually solo designers, or I've been a solo designer for a really long time. So I'm actually curious to hear your experience with your day-to-day and who you work with and kind of like the pros and cons that you're feeling of being a solo designer.
Yeah, so I think what I do love about being the solo designer is I have a lot of ownership over all the work that I do. So I actually don't have that many meetings, which is great. But I think there are definitely some trade-offs. So I work very closely with our developers, and because I don't work with other designers, they're kind of my main sounding board, which is great on one end because they are very involved in the design process as well as my product manager. So they're kind of like my core people that I run ideas by. They're kind of like, they give me critiques. We do a whole thing. So we are very close, which I think is very great for our team. But I think the trade-offs are kind of that not being able to have kind of a design community within your company is sometimes pretty difficult. And kind of having to present your work always to non-designers is also sometimes a challenge. Like having, I think for me, my strategy is always to like create full mock-ups, even for just ideas, because often non-designers can't really visualize what you're talking about with just lo-fi sometimes. So that's definitely another thing. And then I think something that I didn't expect as a solo designer is how much of my job will be design advocacy versus just design work. Just kind of having to fight for design all constantly in a company, especially because the company that I work at it's not a startup, so it's been around for a little while, but I was one of the first designers hired. So like you can tell that design hasn't really been a priority here. So trying to kind of like get more responsibility and get people to pay more attention to design, that is a huge part of my job that I didn't really realize going into it.
It sounds like for me, I'm a blend of both of you. I have the size of what Jennifer has, but I have all the meetings that Kristina has. So in the happy medium right there, not really so. But I will say it is nice to be the owner of design, but to Jennifer's point, like you do have to kind of like prove it over and over again, like to the rest of the company. I'm at least fortunate in the scenario of the company has also been around like Jennifer's, but they've never prioritized design until 2 years ago. But I think my biggest challenge has always been to get people to stop using UI and UX interchangeably. They are not the same. So everyone at my company likes to talk about UI, and I'm like, yeah, that's not what we're talking about here. So I would say trying to just get everyone on the same page, regardless of work environment, especially when it comes to design, is a very challenging and daunting task. All right. Well, something you mentioned, Jennifer, that actually leads us really, really nicely to another question that was submitted was, how do you find your balance between actually designing and doing all the other things that let you design later on? We'll start with Jennifer. We'll go the other way.
That's a good question. I don't really know my balance. I think oof, sorry, I have to think about this for a little bit. I think often I have to prioritize design advocacy because that is really the way to get the design work that I want, in a sense. Because if I just focus on the design work, that's just really the things that are being handed off to me by my PM, and it's not always what I think strategically are the projects to be focusing on, or they're more like small gains versus like the big fish, and trying to like, I think they just have to happen concurrently. Yeah, I think something that I'm trying to do at my company is really that I've been spending a lot of time on is building a design team, an internal design team, just kind of like with a cross-functional team with like one person from every department, because at my company no one really talks to each other. At least the design oriented people at my company don't really talk to each other, and trying to like administrate that is becoming a huge part of my job. But I think I've personally been prioritizing that a lot because that's just really going to help in the future and make my life easier, but also kind of building this foundational structure for the company in the future, I think is just so important, and it'll just kind of give design a bigger role at the company. So yeah, I think really, really prioritizing advocacy, I think, in order to do more of the work that I want to do.
What about with you, Kristina?
Yeah, so I would say it definitely wasn't as much of an issue for me when I was in the very early startup, just because, again, our engineers were overseas. And so we didn't have a lot of meetings like in the day. So we'd only maybe meet like once a day or once every couple of days. But I would say it definitely is more of a balance these days, just because of the amount of teams that I support. I would still say though, it's not like an overwhelming, like I don't struggle like to like set aside time to design. Like if I look at some of my PMs and I need to schedule a meeting with them, they are in meetings like I'd say 95% of their days. So I wouldn't say it's to that degree. But some things that I do is, for example, if I am struggling to find some time, I will literally block out my calendar. So I will block out a chunk of time and say like, I'm not taking any meetings. They know not to like schedule over those, because they'll generally try and find an event time when I have an availability. So you can try using that calendar as a way, especially because we are all virtual these days. So there's nobody who's coming over to like tap on my shoulder and disturb me. If they want to meet me, they have to put something on my calendar. So that's just one way of like blocking it off. My company also like implemented like a no meeting Wednesday. So that was very helpful as well. So that's like heads down time for like everybody in the company, where you don't have to worry about speaking with others. You can really focus on what you need to get done for the day. And I would also just say like, sometimes I don't need to be in all of the meetings that I'm invited to. And so it's about standing up for yourself and like asking them like, hey, do you actually need me on the stand up for your team this week? Or is it okay if I sit out? Or it could even just be like, if you need me to go over a design with the engineers, but you have an hour for the entire meeting, like I will join you for the second half of this meeting. And then that way, like I at least save myself maybe like 30 minutes of time. I also have had situations where like PMs are always very eager to like talk about stuff they have me to do, but I'm like, I don't have time for that this week. So I'm going to ask you to like schedule this next week when I'm actually going to be working on your ticket. And then that way as well, like I have all of that knowledge fresh in my head when I'm actually going to work on it, rather than forgetting the smaller details within this time. And that's the way I kind of phrase it. So they're like, oh, okay. And that's kind of how I've managed it when it does feel a little bit tighter on the schedule. But yeah, those are kind of my tips and tricks.
I'm learning some good stuff from you, and I've been doing this for a while, but I am learning some good stuff. I'm kind of the opposite, where like I'm in meetings for at least 5 hours a day with engineers all day, every day, because I have members of my engineer team who like to go rogue with some of the design. So that is the other thing that you may have to balance too as a designer. There are going to be times where developers just think that they know best, and sometimes they do, but sometimes they need to go with what has been discussed in design. So that sometimes comes with the job. All right, so we're going to pivot a little bit. There's a really intriguing question in the questions tab. And you all, I love that you guys are all asking questions about interviews and case studies and all that, but we're going to focus on day-to-day life as a UX designer at a small company. However, I will take those ideas and we will put together some other workshops and webinars where we can discuss things more related to hiring and recruiting. How's that sound? Thumbs up from everyone if you agree. Cool. All right. So one of the intriguing questions was from Matt. What were some of your challenges that you faced during your first year as a designer? So we're gonna dig deep in our past here a little bit. Who wants to go first? Either one.
I can go. I think Emily can also probably speak to this, but because it was my first job and being the only product designer, I think one of the biggest challenges was figuring out what my job was on my own. There was no one to tell me what I was supposed to be doing. And I think that is definitely one of the challenges of being a solo designer, without mentorship or without having senior designers to really show you the ropes. My first year, which I pretty much just finished like last month, so still very much in that mindset, but so much trial and error. I made a lot of mistakes, and I think the difference is that there's no one to really catch your mistakes. So some of my mistakes have shipped, which is another another thing that you'll have to deal with. And I think just like, yeah, learning as you go, even just small technical stuff, like how to organize my files. There's no one that did all this before me. So what are the naming conventions that I should be using for our files? How should I structure them? All these types of things that I had to do like outside research on my own to figure out, instead of like, following protocol, something like that.
How about you, Kristina?
Yeah, so for me, thankfully I had some folks on my team. So my manager had been designing for quite a long time, and particularly in that industry. I think for me, the biggest challenge was just like, okay, I had like my tool set, like I know like what is the process I have to go through, but now I have to apply it to a real life situation in an industry that I know nothing about. So the startup that I joined was about like big data, ML, AI, and me coming from teaching, I was like, I don't know anything about this. So for me, it was a lot of ramp up time was just around gaining like knowledge about the industry, which was like a struggle for me because I came from zero. Thankfully, like my CEO like gave us a lot of like lessons on like understanding like how all of this works, so that I'd be able to at least create experiences that make sense for users who are like such power users like within their individual fields. So I think a lot of my struggles was around just that piece. But what's interesting was also just that right in design lab you learn one way kind of to like do a design process, and like there are different things that you can try out, but obviously like every company kind of has a different process, and even based off of maybe your manager, that process is very different. And so like learning to adapt what I had learned in design lab to like this process that my manager was used to and wanted us to follow was also kind of like that transition for me, and trying to understand those pieces. I would say obviously there's still like the basic foundations, like he still had us doing like lo-fi wireframes and so on and so forth. But it was also just like the process in which we like hand off our designs to engineers. I think when I was going through design lab, we were like redlining things. My manager wanted me to hand off designs on Google, like on Google Slides. And so I had to like take screenshots of all my designs and like write out all how the interactions work. And I would even like mini prototype, like if you click here, it would jump to another slide that explained like how that worked. And so I was like, okay, so that was like different for me as well. And I would also say just like with early startups as well, is like you have the chance to like create new processes. And so like one thing that my manager wanted me to take on was to learn accessibility and make sure that our designs were all compliant. And like in design lab, I had heard the term, yeah, accessibility is important, but like back then for me, it was just like put your colors in a color contrast, and that was all I really knew how to do. But he wanted me to really like take charge of this, and so I had to look into like what is Section 508, how do I actually like what's a VPAT and all of these other things. And so like being able to like really dive deep on these subjects that I had kind of like just barely grazed the surface in design lab, right? Like just trying to like deepen my knowledge in the areas that like my company found important, was also like things that I really had to like learn how to pick up while I joined there.
So we're transitioning nicely into the next part, which is process. So Kristina, you mentioned process already. So two-part question, whoever wants to answer. So first part is, from the process that we learned in design lab, specifically phase one, where we cover every single part of the design process, how much of that is or I guess for Kristina, how much of that was utilized at your last job? And then Jennifer, how much of that is utilized currently? And do you like, where do you think that there could be improvements?
Yeah, so I would say in both, probably in my current company and the last company, for a large majority of the time that I worked there, we weren't able to really do that much research. So that in terms of like being able to actually sit down with potential customers and users, for my early startup, it was more so we didn't have any customers yet because we were very brand new. So a lot of it was like, rather than being able to conduct user interviews, a lot of it was talking to subject matter experts to understand like how they understand these things. So it wasn't exactly like our exact customers, but they still had some knowledge that they could share with us so we could understand like okay, what would make the most sense. It was also like doing competitive analysis, but not in the same sense as I did for design lab. It's like very like particularly looking at like one feature rather than like comparing our entire application and trying to find like the differences there. And even these days, like I tend to just like take screenshots of like how other companies handle this. And that's like the depth that I do my competitive analysis of. It's not like the fancy like table where you have all of your little grids like we did through design lab. And then I would say like beyond the research in terms of like the actual design work, when I was at the startup, we did do lo-fi. So we actually had a tool called Balsamic that I actually really liked because when I first started Design Lab, I was always like, I don't like doing pen and paper. Like, I'm not good with anything hand drawn. And so I really love that tool because it's basically just like they have like really rough looking components that you can just drag and drop in. But it's just like black and white. So for me, that was like my low to mid-fi kind of stuff that I did. And then from there, we would usually jump to more hi-fi. But I thought that worked well. I would say at my current company, like almost every designer functions a little bit differently. It's more of like your personal preference, so long as you are able to complete it within the timeline. So I would say most of my designers currently don't do lo-fi. A lot of them actually jump straight to hi-fi, which can be a little like testy. So these days I'm actually gotten better about like doing more lo-fi because I don't have the time to actually go through like low, mid, and hi-fi. But at least like if I can jot down some ideas on like paper really quickly, then that helps me at least like get my brain kind of in the right space without committing to it too far. And then yeah, so and also just because I'm not able to talk to customers as much, usability testing doesn't get done quite as frequently as I would like it to be. So a lot of like understanding if my designs are successful actually happens more, but like after things have gone out live and we're getting feedback from our customers about whether they love it or they hate it, and then we have to revisit it, which I personally don't necessarily agree with, but that's unfortunately just the way it kind of goes right now.
Similar for me, but what about you, Jennifer?
Very similar for me as well. Definitely agreed with you, Kristina, about the research. That's just definitely something that is not currently, we just don't have a lot of time, or also just, yeah, a lot of the processes aren't there to do that right now in my current role. I think, especially when I started, that was the case. A lot of, when I started, I work in kind of the real estate research industry, and I also didn't have any idea what this industry was. I had no background in real estate. So I had to just get a lot of direction from my manager, who comes from an analyst background. So just like taking his word for it that because he has client interactions. So that was just kind of the gist of my research in the beginning. But I think just little things that I've been doing to kind of get a little bit more access to clients and their feedback is sitting in on client calls with our client services team, and just kind of, even if I'm not asking questions or doing interviews, just kind of listening in to their onboardings and seeing what types of questions they ask, what their goals are and things like that, and kind of taking notes. And it's not quite interviews, but just getting a better idea of what they need or want. So that has been really helpful. So that's kind of the extent of the research that I'm able to do with our clients. But I also try to do more research with like stakeholder interviews within our company, like the people that have ownership over certain types of projects that we're doing. Just getting a better idea about like company and business goals that that are important for whatever project. So yeah, I think those are some ways that I've been trying to incorporate more user research into my role, because it's definitely sometimes really challenging because it's just not, there's just not enough time in our timelines. We just go straight to wireframing or mocking up oftentimes.
Yep, I would agree with that. And at least for me, my PMs are very well versed in the industry. So I work for construction software industry. So my PMs thankfully are very well versed in it. So they have been in it for a long time. They know what users like, don't like, what are their day-to-day things that need to happen. So thankfully I have a lot of guidance there. But yeah, research is just something that just most companies they either can't or won't dedicate time to. And it's mainly because the priority is to get features out, right? Like you're trying to sell a product, you're trying to sell a service. So ultimately you are there to answer customer needs. So we sometimes do have to work backwards, right? Like sometimes we work backwards with the feedback that we get from things that get shipped. And then we sit there with our, hands in our palms and we're like, oh God, like again, like we talked about this, but here we are. So it's a thing, everyone, like regardless of size of the company, I feel like almost everyone does go through that. So if you do work for a company that prioritizes research, I will say Intuit is a design first company. They have a dedicated research team here in San Diego. They have a dedicated research building that they have. They even go to people's houses and give them like $300 to watch them use TurboTax. It's insane. So there are companies that do prioritize research. Unfortunately, it's just not a greater percentage than it should be. Okay, so we're getting some spicy questions right now, but Emily, not me, Emily, another Emily from our community, has mentioned that she's also the only designer at her last job and trouble advocating for design. So I'm sure regardless of size of company and size of team, we all often run into times where it's hard to advocate for what we think is actually best for the user. So how do you kind of reposition the conversation with folks who aren't designers to get them on the same page?
This is an ongoing challenge for me. I definitely hit roadblocks a lot with this for sure. I think I don't really have like a fail safe answer, but I think just constantly pivoting, um, trying to pitch to people that are more like-minded and higher up in the company that can kind of also advocate for you using their positions, I think is also really important. And because I work for a research company, they're all about data. So getting like actual numbers when you present or pitch to get executives more on board, saying like, if we did this, it could increase like our ROI by like, I don't know, however much percent. This is the data that backs it up. And so we should invest in this and that kind of thing. But yeah, I think also just sometimes I have to take a step back though, because I get rejected. And then just really think about the trade-offs. Like, even if they said no to me on this, what other smaller thing can I get? And just kind of like breaking up my goals into smaller goals and just kind of try to just move the needle forward a little bit is kind of my strategy right now.
Yeah, I would say it's also similar for us. So some of the work that I've been trying to do is more accessibility related, which not fully like trying to advocate for design, but like similar techniques in that um, different stakeholders care about different things, right? So as much as we would love to think that everybody's very human and wants to do what's right for everybody like in the world, uh, that's not always going to cut it from like just going about it like from the empathetic route. Usually that works a lot better with like the design team or like sometimes the PM team. But for me, like when I was trying to advocate to like our CEO, like why we should be spending money on this particular effort, it's more of like focusing it from like a business, like uh, that perspective of like, okay, like how much money can we get out of doing this, right? So for me, for example, it was we'd be able to attract more customers who do need these additional like considerations where like other people in our field do not have accessible products, right? And so that gives us one leg up. If you have if you want to work with the government, your product needs to be accessible. And so we have a large percentage like in healthcare. And so a lot of that work, like we want to also make sure that we're able to continue working with these particular clients. And we actually have to be able to say that we are actually compliant in order to work with them. And so that's another piece there. But there's a lot of like, it's just trying to understand what is important to that particular stakeholder that you're trying to communicate with. And then being able to come up with like those points that better appeal to them, right? And it does vary so much depending on who you're speaking to.
Definitely. All right, next spicy question. It's not super spicy, but I am actually intrigued by this one. And I'm going to generalize it a little bit. This is Rob's question in the questions tab. How do you guys work through scenarios where you guys actually aren't able to get any sort of data that allows you to make informed decisions? Just power through it.
So I would say actually our company doesn't do that good of a job of like tracking metrics. I think our metrics is like our North Star is like daily number of users, which like can work, but right, if you think about like a SaaS company, right, like people aren't using this because it's for fun, they're using this for their job, right? And for some of them, the tasks that they need to perform are not something that requires them to log on every single day in order to do. Maybe they just need to like run a report once a week. And so What's interesting, I guess like one of the nice things about working in a smaller company is that we've identified that this is like a large issue for us. And so like part of the work that we're doing as an entire product team is like trying to like understand, okay, what are some ways that we can start identifying better metrics? So we're looking at like the heart framework and so on and so forth, and trying to actually like do some research about like what are the different ways that other companies are tackling this, and how can we actually apply this and improve our process. And I think that's one of the nice things, right? If you go join a Google or Facebook, it's a lot harder for you to touch like and change entire processes. But when you're in a small company, like you have that opportunity to change the way that things are still being done. So I think that's been really cool. And like, okay, like, yeah, we don't do a good job of like understanding like how things are going. But like we understand that that's like our weakness. And so we're gonna start like working to improve that. So that's kind of very high level. But in terms of like day to day and understanding, like it's just also like, while I don't have a lot of data on like the success rate or like the failure rate, right? But customers still speak to our CSMs, for example, about like what they're struggling with or what they really enjoy. And so while I don't get to necessarily speak to customers very often, I can talk to the people in our company who do get to speak to our customers on a very daily basis. And so I'll often like reach out to our CSMs. We also have like a forum in which they can kind of like chat with us and let us know like these different opinions. And so it's not like quantitative data, but it is more qualitative in that sense. And it's also just right, like when you're designing, like intuitive design, right? Like, am I reinventing the wheel every single time in ways that don't make sense? Or like, if there's something that exists that works really well, like why not just like set up my interaction that way? And I know that's already been successful because 100 bajillion companies are already doing that. So it's also just being really smart about the way that you kind of design and where you choose to be more innovative and whatnot.
Yeah, I think very similarly to Kristina, although we really don't have a lot of the same processes, but I think oftentimes I think I just wing it, but also, but yeah, kind of taking a lot of influence from other companies and what already works, and kind of using that to inform whatever products we're working on. But very similarly to Kristina, just like kind of relying on our client services team, as well as anyone that just gets feedback. We have like an info management email where clients can just directly reach kind of our general department to ask any questions or like any criticisms or anything like that. So we do have access to a lot of client feedback. So just kind of implementing a lot of those things as we go, pretty much. Or like they ship and then we get feedback and then we make changes.
Yep, definitely. I'm again hybrid both of you, so it's good to know that we're all kind of trending in the same direction here. So I love that. All right, I think we might have time for maybe like 2 or 3 more questions, but one that I do want to touch on is working with developers, because I know we haven't touched on that too much, but I would love to know just about your general working relationship with developers and kind of what's expected in that kind of handoff process.
Yeah, so for me, when I was working at the startup, again, mentioned it a little bit earlier, but we would essentially set up calls where once I had some designs ready that I had signed off already with my head of product design and the CEO, who was our substitute PM in this situation, we then would show it to the engineers. And back then I had everything documented in the Google Slides, as I mentioned. So it would have like each screenshot of that particular page with some additional notes that I had written to the side. Again, the janky prototyping where you can click on certain things and jump to different slides. But I would essentially walk them through like the entire flow of the designs that I had created, and they would have the time to essentially ask me any questions, or if they had any like concerns about what would be really difficult for them to build out, for example, within a particular time constraint. And depending on like the situation, sometimes I would go back and revise some of the designs to accommodate some of their concerns, or Other times, you gotta defend your design decision, say like, this is not something that I'm willing to like compromise because this will like really impact the user experience, for example, right? So also understanding like where to pick your battles is really important when you're working with both PMs and also like the engineers. It is, you can't always have it your way, right? So just like be conscious about what's really worth kind of that fight. And then from there, the engineers would go and develop. And once they had like some builds, then they would kind of show us or they tell us how to access it. And we would go in and just QA it, compare it to our original designs, and just kind of document, for example, if there are some padding issues or if they did choose to implement it a different way. I would question like, why is this different? And again, depending on if it broke the experience or not, then like we would have to, ask them to revise it. Or if it's like a minor thing that doesn't have too big of an impact, then usually sometimes I'll let it go. But that's kind of how we handled that collaboration piece back then.
So I work on a really small team, and so with our developers, because we work so closely together, we don't really have a lot of formal processes in terms of like handoff. A lot of times, also because I don't have that many meetings every day, my meetings are with the developers, so we're often like co-working together. We're just having each other on a video call, and they're like building it, and I'm giving feedback as they're building it sometimes. So that actually, I think because we are such a small team, I don't think this would be possible in larger teams where like you have a lot more things going on. But that has really worked for us because I could just give them a lot of feedback in real time, or they can ask me questions in real time. And so, yeah, just a lot of just co-working sessions is what we do. But anytime we're not doing that, similar things, I usually just hand off. I don't really do like a formal file. I do kind of a similar, I show them, I do a presentation on my design, walk them through it. And then as I give them the file, and then as they go through it, I will annotate and start doing revisions that way. Yeah.
Awesome. So for me, something I do want to call out and just share with everyone here, when you work with developers, devs don't know what you don't know. So sometimes if they tell you that they think something could be built better, don't fight them immediately, because that would normally be my initial gut reaction too. But instead ask them why. Like ask them why, and like ask them about is it because of the time and effort it's going to take to develop the solution that we're hoping to get? And if the answer is yes, work with them to like find out like how things are actually built. That way you can take that and relate that to when you design. So having an understanding of how things are built, I don't think as a designer you actually need to know code. It's nice to know, but I don't think you need to know it. But it's nice to have an understanding of how things are built in code, so that way when you do design things, you can keep that in mind, like, oh, this interaction pattern is going to happen. Oh, we can't do this because of this past conversation of this component. So those are all important things. Like developers are willing to work with you as a designer, but it's very much ingrained in them, at least from my experience and having been friends with a lot of developers, they just like to go heads down and just do the developing thing. They just want to be told what needs to be done, and they'll ask questions when they need to. So, but that doesn't mean that they're not willing to work with designers. You just kind of have to put yourself out there and say, let's work together. So that is what I wanted to share. Cool. All right. So this one is a little bit more of a, like, how are you enjoying things right now? So like, is there anything at the beginning of being a designer where you're like, oh, really hate doing that, and now you're like, you know what? It's not so bad. It's not so bad. So where do we stand on all these things?
I can hop in. So I will say I am overall really enjoying being a product designer. As I mentioned, I used to teach, and I don't have nearly the same concerns as I used to in the past. So I do see myself being in this field, hopefully for quite a long time. It is turning out kind of the way I expected it to. I would say for me in the beginning, I had a lot of imposter syndrome, just because like obviously I'm very new to the field. There's a lot that I'm learning, and that for me, like I feel like every teacher was always like the people pleaser, like I want to do right, and so on and so forth. And so for me, like I always had that concern of like, oh, like, am I performing to what my teammates are kind of expecting? And so for me, that was probably like my biggest worry, both like in my first company and even in the second one. And so like just trying to overcome that and like coming to peace that like, hey, like I am new, like I am not going to be able to know everything, but like what am I going to do about it? Like how am I going to be able to help myself? And for me, like it's like about having that like growth mindset of like it's okay to fail sometimes. And like your teammates hired you knowing that you were a junior designer, right? And they want to help you and set you up for success. So rather than always like wallowing in my self-doubt, like I was like, you know what? I don't know this. I'm going to ask somebody for help and like make sure that I don't continue to be in this situation where I'm just like, I don't know. So I think for me, I finally overcome that like maybe just like a few months ago, right? And I've been in this field for a little over like 2 years now. And so that was just something that I kind of had to overcome when I was like just being in a brand new field. But otherwise, like I am really enjoying like the day to day and the work itself. Like designing is really awesome. User research for me was kind of also like a difficult for me at first because I was always like, ooh, like I kind of copped out when I did design lab. I like always asked like my friends and family to do my user interviews for me. And then when you join the company, you obviously can't do that. And so I was like, oh, I have to actually talk to strangers and actually like get their thoughts. And that was super terrifying for me. But like after doing it a couple times, I'm like, okay, I think like I understand like what's going on now. So it's just like actually being in the field and actually doing things like for real, like that first time can be like a little bit scary. But yeah, like you just gotta throw yourself in there and do it. And yeah, I really love the work that I do now. So no regrets on my end.
Wait, can you say the question one more time?
Yeah, like is there anything from like when you started as a designer that you're like not I don't like this and now you're like it's not so bad, I can do it, it's fine.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think when I went into this field, I really wanted to be more of a visual designer. I really loved visual design. But now I think, I mean, I talked a lot about, kind of a lot of roadblocks in a company like this, but I think now I actually really enjoy it, the strategy portion of it, even figuring out how to fight for user experience or how to fight for design at a company, but also having the because it's kind of like a blank slate almost, and it's actually when I changed my perspective, it was kind of exciting to be in the forefront of building this new thing at this company. So I think once I had that shift, it stopped being so stressful and just becoming a little bit more fun and just thinking about how much impact I could have. Yeah.
For sure. For me, the thing I hated the most and still have imposter syndrome about is actually UI design. So I'm like the opposite, where like I wanted to stray away from UI design, visual design, because it's just such a subjective thing, colors and fonts and all that. I'm like, you know what? I'm not gonna sit here and argue with you about that. Like, I don't care that much. I just care about how this works, right? But because I have pretty much only been a solo designer or on a team of max 2 people, I kind of didn't have a choice. I had to make the design system, do all the components, all that stuff. So almost forcing myself into a situation where I don't have a choice actually allowed me to have a much better relationship with UI and visual design. So that is something that in general, I think we're all saying, like, push yourself out of your comfort zone. You don't have to go too fast. You can go at your own pace, but to ultimately be a better designer, you should at least have an understanding of how to do every part of the design process. Not saying you have to be perfect at all of them, but you can have your preferences, but at least know how to go through everything, go through the motions. Cool. All right. Well, we're going to wrap up with our last 4 minutes. Thank you, Kristina and Jennifer. Kristina, before I forget, could you drop information about the group that you manage or help things in the chat? Yeah, because I know we had a few questions about that. And then I guess while you're doing that, Jennifer, are there any kind of last words that you like folks to just take away from this presentation about, not just working as a designer at a small company, but just being a UX designer or even considering it as a career?
I really like what you said, actually. I think you said something about everyone is going at their own pace, or just like go at your own pace. I think that's something that was hard for me. It's still hard for me. I also have a lot of imposter syndrome and just kind of not comparing myself to other students or other grads, and just kind of carving out my own path. But also, I guess one big piece of advice is, as a student, I didn't really do a lot of outside work in Design Lab. I just did the course. And I think students definitely should. Like, just keep building on knowledge, keep seeking out just everything you can. Learn more about design systems, learn more about, how to do a dev handoff, like just all of those things that maybe are more touched on lightly in the course. Just really push yourself out there, push yourself to find a lot of this information.
Kristina, your words of wisdom for people.
Yes.
Sorry, yes, she does. Everyone, hold please.
The website. Yeah, I would say, I guess on the topic of like the series of like small, big companies, so on and so forth. And this is something, if you've been in my group crits, I've mentioned a lot before. But I think when I was a student, I was like, I'm gonna come out, I'm gonna join a FANG company and make lots of big money, and it's gonna be a fantastic time. And obviously, I joined like a 10-person startup, which was completely different. And I think, right, it's really important to be flexible for that first job, because it's really just about getting your foot in the door. And I can say, like, now that I've had the chance to experience these like very early startups and more of a mid-sized company, I realize what's important really so much is like the size. But for me personally, like having a good manager is probably like my number one thing now. I give huge props to Jennifer and Emily for being solo designers, but like I have seen myself grown so much from being able to work under the right manager and being given the right opportunities, and just having that continuous mentor relationship, even in my working career. And so, like, if you can find the right team and the right manager to work for, like that's going to help you grow so much as a junior designer or like a beginner designer, right? And so I would say, like, don't worry about like the size of the company too much or the industry or so on and so forth. Like you have so much time to be able to like get into that dream company of yours. For now, just like really focus on like finding a company where you can really grow your skill sets, and to really like dive deep into like being a designer. And then like you can then focus on like, oh, okay, maybe I feel really passionate about ed tech and that's the industry I want to be in one day. Like you'll have time for that. So don't worry about like finding that ideal situation the very, very first time. So that would be kind of like my nugget to take away.
For sure. And one other thing I just want to add before we wrap up is that please don't just also look at, I know it's, not for everyone, but contract opportunities are just as good. So for me, my first year of design was all contract jobs because it was hard for me to land a role as a junior designer. Because at that time, especially like 5-6 years ago, UX design was really starting to pick up, but not quite so much where people were willing to trust junior designers at that time. So the only way for me to continuously get practice and get my feet wet was to do contract jobs. So biggest difference is that you get hired permanently at a company, you get that onboarding time, you get time to learn about the product, the company, the service, whatever it is. But on contracts, you're just thrown right in. You don't get that context. So you do need to know how to be able to flex, jump right in, ask questions, ask for context, all that stuff. So it's just a difference in approach and how you approach your career and what you want. But all opportunities are all learning opportunities. So even if one doesn't jive with you, just know that there are other ones out there, but there's always something that you can take away from every opportunity that you go through. Cool. All right. So that is my piece of wisdom for today. Thank you, ladies, both so much. I'm so happy. I also don't ever get to see these ladies. I've worked with them for years and we maybe see each other once a year. So I love this. This is how we're doing it. But thank you all so much for being here. Really, really happy. And that you all found this really informative. I know sometimes we get a little bit off topic, but we want to keep it casual. We'll keep it a little bit informal here. So stay tuned. We will have more in this series. We titled this episode One Small Company. Next one is going to go the opposite way. We're going to hear from people who've worked at very large companies. One who's worked at Yelp, our other facilitator, Robin, if you've been to her group crits, you know how amazing she is. All of us know how amazing she is. So yeah, thank you. Have a great weekend. This is recorded. If you're here, that means you registered. You're going to get an email with the recording. Otherwise, go on YouTube. It'll be there as well. Follow us on all our social things, and have a good Friday and have a good weekend. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.